Oh, we are holding, we're up to, we're up to paragraph 8. We're up to paragraph 8, and we've talked about the idea of Hishtava Satsura and Shinui Hatsura. The idea that we spoke briefly about it, but the idea that the thing that doesn't exist within a Kadosh Baruch Hu prior to creation, or the thing that isn't actualized in a Kadosh Baruch Hu prior to creation, is the idea of a Ratzon Lakabo. That is the thing that gets created, Yesh Me'ayin, ex nihilo, something out of nothing. The thing that didn't exist before, the difference between creation and pre-creation, the thing that changes with Bereshis is the existence of a Ratzon Lakabo. And based on that, the Baal HaSulam told us that from that we can understand that the only necessary condition, the only necessary characteristic for creation to exist is that Ratzon Lakabo. That is the sum total definition of creation. Everything else is the same. Nothing else is different from pre-creation to post-creation, before Bereshis to after Bereshis, or in Sof to after the Tzimtzum. Nothing changes except the fact that there is now an actualized Ratzon Lakabo, and everything else is the same. And so we talked about how the consequence of that is in part that, number one, aside from the Ratzon Lakabo, everything is just Elokos. Aside from the existence of a Ratzon Lakabo, whatever aspect of Ratzon Lakabo one identifies, and everything created consists of a Ratzon Lakabo, which is the kli that forms the definition, the structure, the limits of whatever created thing we're talking about. Aside from that created aspect of every nivra, of every created thing, everything of that thing is pure or elokos. And so we didn't talk about this last time, but if we talk about nitzotzos and so-called sparks, little sparks, or little bits of godliness and everything, that's what we're talking about. Everything has a chomer and a tzura, everything has a form, and then has an underlying substance to that thing. The underlying substance takes different forms in different creations: apples, oranges, chairs, tables, cats, dogs, me and you, and so on and so forth. The essence is all pure godliness, is or elokus, is no different than what existed prior to creation. The only difference is that now, after creation, there's a Ratzon Lakabel, and the Ratzon Lakabel results in that elokus, that or, which is expanding and filling everything just as it was prior to creation. That elokus now lands within Kalim, and those Kalim give that Elokos particular definition and limited definition. So now there's a Ratzon Lakabel of a particular sort that turns a certain, that holds really a certain Elokos, receives a certain amount or a certain aspect of the Or Elokos, and it turns or portrays or manifests that Elokos as the thing we know of as an apple, and a table, and a chair, and an orange, and a cat, and a dog, and me and you. That's where we were last time. Now, based on all of this, we can get into paragraph 8, which in this edition of the Baal HaSulam, the new Koran edition of the Baal HaSulam, it has helpful paragraph headings or section headings that give us this is not printed in the original edition of the Hakdama to the Zohar, but here in this edition, the editors have provided section headings, subject headings, before different sections. So here, the section is Haneshamos Chelek Elokam Imal. Right. So now the next few paragraphs are going to deal with the idea of the neshama, which is a Chelek Elokam Imal. And he opens up in paragraph 6 by paragraph 8, excuse me, by taking us back to the third chakira that he talked about earlier on, back in paragraph 3. He says as follows: Umikan. Now, based on what we've said about the Ratzon Lakabel being the only thing that's been created, and that's the thing that distinguishes between prior to creation and after creation, that is the Yesh Me'ayin, that is the only true thing that actually changes when creation happens. Mikan ba'anu gam l'sof daitum shalom mekubalam she'avanu b'chakira gimel. Now, Based on all of this, we can understand and we can get at the idea. Um, we can get at the intent behind the idea that the Mikubalim talk about, that we discussed in Chakira number 3, in investigative question and analytic question number 3. Shatimanu Aleihim, we asked about the Mikubalim, we asked about the classic idea that is brought up by the Mikubalim, Ech Efshar Lomar al Neshamal Shehin Chel. How can you say, which is what the Mikubalim say, how can you say that a neshama, a soul, is a chelik elokami mal, is a part of God, is a part of God? Behashva el ha'even shenachzava mehahar, in a way that equates it to a stone that has been quarried or cloven off of a mountain. Shein hefresh beinehem, there's no difference between the stone and the mountain, except for the fact that the stone is part of the whole is the mountain. Right? Now, there's an important point here just before we get to the actual Chakira, just review the actual Chakira as he gives us here. And the important point here, and this tracks what we've said until now, and the Mikubalim are particular about this, they're giving us the example of a stone quarried from the mountain, and a neshama is like a stone that's been quarried from a mountain. Difference inherently between the stone and the mountain, right? Except for part and whole. The inner characteristics, the essential qualities of the stone, let's say, again, using the metaphor, geologically, the piece of stone that has been quarried off of the mountain is geologically the same as the stone of the mountain. If I take stone from different mountains, every rock formation is going to be geologically different from each other. And based on the qualities of this rock and that rock, we can tell where they came from. But the stones that come off this mountain are going to be the same as this mountain, except that the stone is small and the mountain is big. The stone is a part of the whole, which is the mountain. So in that sense, the analogy works quite well. Our souls are godliness. It's actually very profound. It's not a simple thing. It's very, very deep. But our souls are just godliness, the same qualities and the same full spectrum of godliness, and whatever God consists of, that is what our soul consists of. It's the makeup is the same. B'tselem Elokim Nivra Adam, the makeup, the essential makeup is the same. But our soul is a piece of the whole. Vitimanu, the Baal HaSulam continues, we asked about this. We said, Tenacha even shenifreda min hahar. I understand when you talk about a stone that's carved off of a mountain. How do you get a stone off of a mountain? You take a hammer and you take a chisel and you chop it off, right? Meaning there's a mechanism by which the part becomes separate from the whole. If there's no essential difference between the stone and the mountain, what is it that differentiates the stone from the mountain? Part and whole. And how does part and whole come into being? What causes the stone to be a part rather than the whole? What causes the separation between the stone and the mountain? There's a tool that has to be used. There's a mechanism in the physical world. There's a mechanism that has to be used to affect the now new reality that there's a difference between the stone and the mountain, the difference being part and whole. And that mechanism, that tool, is a hammer and a chisel. But when we're referring to the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how is it possible to say such a thing, right? The nefesh, the soul, is a chelek of the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's identical with the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's composed of the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, except that it's just part of the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What is it in the world that could separate the neshama from the essence of God? How can it that then the neshama separates from being part and parcel, one and totally unified with, actually part of, one with the essence of the creator of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself? to now become something that's distinct, right? The chelek. How can it be? What is it that can separate the whole from the part? That's really the question that we're trying to get at. That's the question that he's trying to discuss. What is it? What mechanism is it that separates the whole from the part? How does that happen? And in essence, really, the question goes back to something we've been discussing until now, which is if HaKadosh Baruch Hu encompasses everything, then what thing outside of HaKadosh Baruch Hu functions in such a way as to separate apart from a whole of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Meaning the mountain isn't everything. So there are things that exist outside of the mountain, and those things can operate on the mountain, subject and object, subject operating on object. Hammer and operates on the mountain, distinct and separate and outside of the mountain, and therefore can operate on the mountain to cause a separation and a chipping away of the mountain to now create the reality of a part of the mountain versus the whole of the mountain. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is all-encompassing and nothing is outside of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then how can it be that there is any mechanism? What would the mechanism even be? But how can there be any mechanism that could separate or operate on HaKadosh Baruch Hu to so to speak, separate a piece off so that now there's a piece and now there's a whole, and there's something creating that distinction between piece and whole and a separation, which is the essence of the distinction between the piece and the whole. What is that thing that could operate on it? How can it be? Nothing is outside of HaKadosh Baruch Hu itself. Everything is part of that mountain, right? Meaning, if the mountain was made up of all the chisels in the world and all of the hammers in the world, then it would make no sense. And how could it be that a hammer and chisel operates on the mountain to create a rift in the mountain, to separate a rock from itself? Likewise, what is it that is, so to speak, outside of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that can operate on the atzmos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the whole, in order to create a separation and thereby create now a part that is separate from the whole? That was our question. That was our chakira, the third chakira that we raised earlier. Ubehamisbar, move on hadavar hetiv. But now that we've explained what we've explained in the previous sections, now we can understand this very well. Ki kamosha hagarz mechatechu mavdil bedavar gashmi lechalko l'shnayim, just as the hammer and the chisel, just as the axe separates physical things, dividing them into two parts, kach shinui hatsura mavdil beruchani lechalko l'shnayim. So too, the concept, right? It's not an object, but the concept of shinui hatsura, the concept of essential difference, difference in essential form, that is what separates spiritual things, or in the realm of spirituality, intangible spirituality. That is the mechanism that operates within the realm of spirituality to separate things from each other. Lemashal, he explains this, and we'll have to work this out a little bit and think it through, but let's first get through the paragraph. Lemashal, for example, when you have two people who love each other, we would say that they are close to each other, they're connected to each other, they're attached to each other as if they're one body. To the extent that they're close, we could say that they're attached like one. They become one. The most intense and deepest and closest attachment, v'yu l'basar echad, you become one. Ulehafich, and then this kishem sonim zeh, when you have people who hate each other, tomar shem rechokim ish mire'ehu karachok mizrach mimarav. We would say that they're far from each other, like east and west. Ve'ein kan inin shel kirvas makom or richuk makom, and we're not talking about spatial distance. We're not talking about spatial distance or spatial closeness. What we're talking about when we talk about people loving each other being close and people hating each other being far from each other, what we're actually speaking about, right? We use these words, but what we're really talking about, we're using words of closeness and distance, but what we're really talking about is hishtavos hatzura, is alignment, similarity, alignment of their essential form. Shebihiosim shavim b'tzurasam ishtarei, who when two people are aligned in their essential form, their essence is aligned with each other. They have the same essence. Their essence aligns with the other person's essence. She'ohev kol ma shechaver ohev v'soneh kol ma shechaver soneh. You love what the other person was and you hate what the other person hates, uchudoma, and other similar things that align you with each other, similar interests, similar goals, similar aspirations, similar pains and similar history and experience and so on and so forth. You can identify with each other. And note, by the way, this is all supraphysical, right? This is ruchnius. This is alignment in a ruchnius way, right? These are not, we look the same, we have the same size, we live in the same place, we're sitting next to each other. These are all things that exist within the realm of spirituality. We like the same things, we enjoy the same things, we have the same goals, we dislike the same things, we have similar backgrounds and similar experiences. These are spiritual realities. So in that sense, when you love what the other person loves, when you hate what the other person hates, when you aspire to what the other person aspires, when you have an affinity for what the other person has an affinity to, then we say that you love each other and you're connected to each other. And when there's a difference in essence, a difference in form, form is not tsura is translated as form, but really it means essence. Right? Form is external. It really means essence, substance. When there's a difference in substance and when there's a difference in essence between people, that you love something even though the other person hates it, and similar types of things. Proportionate to the difference in essence, difference in substance between these two people, we would say that they dislike each other, they hate each other, they're distant from each other. They could be sitting right next to each other, and they could be worlds apart spiritually. Right? Their internal worlds are worlds apart from each other. And if they have opposite essences, opposite substantive spiritual essences, everything that that person likes, I hate. And everything that they hate, I love. Then we're extremely, extremely far from each other, two completely different ends of the spectrum, east, west, north, south, right, left. There's as far as possible we could be from each other, 180 degrees. Okay, this is the critical important concept of shinoi tzura and hishtavos tzura. Okay, this shinoi tzura and hishtavos tzura, this is the mechanism by which things are close and distant, or we apply the words close and distant, which we can use spatially, we can use temporally. Things can be close to each other in space. Things can be close to each other in time or distant from each other in time. And things can be close or distant to each other spiritually. We know how to measure spatial closeness and distance. I take out a ruler and I measure it. I know how to measure temporal closeness and distance. I take out my watch and I measure it. How do I measure spiritual closeness and distance? Which has nothing to do with time and nothing to do with place, right? This is very, this is important to understand. This is really his first dipping our toes, really, or dragging us maybe into really conceptualizing things in ruchnius terms and spiritual terms rather than physical terms or material terms. Right? How do I measure spiritual distance? I measure spiritual distance in terms of hishtavos hatzura and shinoi hatzura. And those two things have nothing to do with spatial distance and temporal distance. You can have hishtavos hatzura across space, right? When two people, when I and my spouse are on different continents, we're very, very close. Doesn't matter that there are 3,000 miles in between us, we're very close. We can also be very close to people who lived 1,000 years ago. Temporally, we're very, very far from each other. In distance, we might be very far from each other. Can't even measure it in distance because we don't exist in the same time, so we can't talk about distance of space. But temporally, we may be very far from each other, but spiritually, we can be very, 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 very close to each other, very closely aligned, strong affinity, right? We find this in Torah all the time, that people learn, people who learn deeply and people who learn intensely, they have affinities for different people in learning. Some people are Maharal people, some people are Rambam people. You're close to those people. Genuinely, you're genuinely close to those people. You can understand how they think. One, it's been a while, but when I was writing my book, my first book on the Aruch HaShulchan, looking at trying to uncover and describe and categorize how the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, went about reaching his decisions and conclusions in the Aruch HaShulchan, in his important restatement of halacha. I spent 3+ years but very, very largely spending my time just poring over the Aruch HaShulchan again and again and again and again and again, from cover to cover, over and over and over again, intensely, deeply dissecting it, unpacking it, taking it apart, putting it back together. And at the end of 3 years, like, I was very close to this person who died 100 years ago, 110 years ago, 15 years ago at the time. Very, very close to him. I understood how his mind worked, or I think I understood how his mind worked, but I felt an affinity for him. We were very aligned. We were very in tune with each other. Never met each other. He lived in Russia. I live here. He lived in the late 1800s, died in 1905. But nevertheless, very, very, very close. Hey, spiritually, in spiritual terms. So this idea of spiritualness and spiritual closeness, spiritual distance, based on Hishtavus Atzura and Shina Atzura, is very, very important. First of all, again, aside from that, he's now going to use it to answer this question about Chelek Elokami Mal and souls chopped off the giant mountain that is God, so to speak. Aside from that, thinking in these terms is now pulling us into a universe and pulling us into the world of the Zohar, pulling us into the world of Kabbalah, which is a non-material world. We have to think of concepts, closeness, distance, not in terms of and measurable in terms of the typical material forms that we use, inches on a ruler, minutes on a watch, and so on. But we have to start thinking about things using the same terminology in a different dimension, a spiritual dimension, an intangible spiritual dimension. Just based on that, I think there's often, you find, I think this is very, very common in many places, there's a contrast that's drawn between spirituality and rationality, or rationality and mysticism, things like that. There's the rational philosophical Judaism, and there's the mystical spiritual Judaism, as if mysticism isn't and Kabbalah isn't rational. I think this is a big misnomer. What we're really talking about, or the contrast people are really talking about, is materialism versus spirituality. There's ways of thinking about Judaism that are all about materiality, the things I can measure in time and space, and thinking about relationships and thinking about ideas and thinking about and understanding texts in those terms, temporal terms, spatial terms, the regular dimensions of materiality, not rationality, but materiality. And then there's a dimension of Kabbalah and Panemius, which is thinking about things not in terms of materiality, but in terms of intangibility and immateriality. They're the things that I can't measure with a ruler, I can't identify. They don't exist in substance, form, time, and space in the material world. It doesn't mean they're not rational. It doesn't mean they're arbitrary. It doesn't mean there's no logic to them. Anyone who's learned the Kisvei Arizal understands that these are incredibly rational things. From their starting points, they build building block by building block, step by step, one after the other. It happens to be that the things they are describing are not empirical and are not material. And that doesn't mean that they aren't rational. It doesn't mean that there's not logic, or that they proceed logically, or that you can ask logical questions about them and seek logical and rational answers about them. But we're talking about these things in different terms, or the things we're talking about using the same terms exist in a different plane, a non-material plane. Okay, so now we've been introduced to the concepts. Paragraph 9. Vincha motzi sheberuchnias poel shinui hatzura kamo hagarzon hamafrid bein hagashmi. So now what we have found that when it comes to the spiritual realm, the intangible realm of spiritual things, spiritual realities, such as closeness and distance in spiritual terms, what we have found is that shinui hatsura, differences in essential form, the differentiation of things in terms of their essential character, their essential form, not their external material empirical characteristics, but in terms of their intangible spiritual substance, this is the same thing. This is like the axe that can slice and divide and chop in half physical things. And the distance that's created between these now separated things that have been separated by Shino Yatsura, the distance between them exists and is defined in terms of the degree to which their tsura, their essence, is different from each other. And from here we can understand Kevan shenitva b'neshamos haratzon lekabel hanaso kanal keniskar la'el, since the ratzon lekabel has been implanted into the neshamos, as we've already explained, it has to be that neshamos have a ratzon lekabel because the purpose of creation is for God to give goodness to us, and we only receive goodness if we have a desire for goodness, and therefore we have to have a desire and a will and a hunger to receive what is being given in order to enjoy it. In order for the purpose of creation to be fulfilled, there has to be a ratzon lekabel implanted within created beings. And this thing, this ratzon lekabel, it must be, it's necessary that this does not exist within the Borei, within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, within the Creator himself. Because God forbid, who could we say that God could ever receive anything from? God is everything. There is nothing else. Or Ein Sof, Mamale Kol HaMetzios, everything, all reality is the Or Ein Sof. There is nothing else outside of it, so it can't receive anything from anywhere because everything is already present within it, and therefore it makes no sense to speak of an actualized Ratzon Lekabel that it could possess. Hare Shinoi Tzura Hazeh Shehesigu Haneshamos Hoa Lahafrida Me'atzmusa Yitzbarach Kedimion Hagarzon Chotzef Ha'eved Menachar. So this Shinoi Hatzura, this Ratzon Lekabel, which does not exist in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but which by necessity must exist within created things, this is the axe. This Shinoi Hatzura, the difference between someone who has everything and has no need and desire for anything else that it doesn't already have, and the experience and existence of need and want and deficiency, that is the garzon, that is the axe that divides and chops off, so to speak, a piece from the mountain. Ba'ofen shal yedei shinu hatzura zeh, in the sense that through this shinu hatzura, through this difference in substance between created things who have a ratzon lekabel and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which only has a ratzon lahashvos but no ratzon lekabel, Yatsu hanashamos michlal borev nivdulu himenu lios nivran. This is what causes neshamos to stop being the bore, or stop being part of the bore, stop being part of the creator. This is what causes a soul to become separated from its source. The thing that separates the soul from its source, because the soul is part and parcel of God itself, chelek elokam imal, the thing that separates the soul from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the birth of a Ratzon Lakabel within the soul, is the creation of a Ratzon Lakabel. That's what turned the bore, or parts of the bore, or pieces of the bore. Again, kaviyachol, so to speak. This is not actual, but in the sense that we experience it and can describe it, this is what causes bits and pieces of God, chelkei elokam imal, souls, to now become created things, as opposed to the creator itself. The existence of a Ratzon Lakaba attached to those things. Amnam kol mashe masigos hanashama me'or yisparach harehu shach yesh me'yesh me'atmus yisparach. However, anything that the soul grasps from God's essence, from God's or, from God's light, God's will, God's ratzon, anything that the soul has other than, as we said before, anything that the soul has other than its Ratzon Lakabel, meaning anything that fills that Ratzon Lakabel, any sense of connection, of satisfaction, anything that's not a sense of lack and need, that is coming yesh meyesh, already existing, that's coming directly from God itself, that is pure godliness. Anything that we're experiencing that is not deficiency is godliness. A very, very profound thing. It's worth just sitting with for a second. Anything that we encounter, anything that we experience, anything we see in the world, any aspect of anything that exists that is not need and lack and deficiency and needness and wanting and desire for something more, is godliness part and parcel itself. Lack is the thing that separates us from essential godliness. A feeling of lack, a sense of lack separates us from essential godliness. But anything that we encounter that isn't essential, deep lack, any sense of fullness, any sense of connection, any sense of satisfaction, any sense of things are good, things are the way they should be, all of that is pure godliness. Ruben, you unmuted for, I assume you want to ask something? Say something.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I just get the noise here, so sometimes.
Okay.
For
Okay. So,
example.
okay. In Cain, if so, nimtza shemebechinas orius bar shemekubelas toch hakli shebehem. If so, what we see is that in terms of the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the energy and essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's received within these kelim, meaning within these Ratzon Lakabels that exist within creation, Shuhu HaRatzon Lakabel, Ein Hefresh Klal B'neiim Latzmus Yisbarach. That light that's received within the kelim, that yesh, that positive existence, right? A Ratzon Lakabel is a negative reality. It's a void. It's a deficiency, it's a need, something is missing, but any positive existence is pure godliness. Ein hefresh klal beinehem latzmusi yisbarach. There's no difference between them and God. Again, because there's no shinut surah between them, because there's no ratzon lakabel operating there. Fullness, satisfaction, wholeness is the absence of a ratzon lakabel, because nothing more is needed, which means that in that sense, there's no difference in separation, distinction between that reality of fullness, wholeness, satisfaction, and God itself. Because what's happening there is that it's the essence of a Kadosh Baruch Hu that is being received, yesh me yesh, meaning the pre-existing reality of God that existed before creation is now just operating there again. There is no new thing, Ratzon Lakabel, that's the new thing that exists within creation. The only thing that's operating there in the place of fullness and the experience of fullness and satisfaction and things being the way they should, the only thing that's operating there is pure godliness as it existed prior to creation. וכל ההפרש שבין הנשמה של עצמוס יסברך אינו יוסר אלא במה שהנשמות הן חלק מעצמוס יסברך, דהיינו ששיר האור שקיבלו תוך הכלי שהוא הרצון לקבל כבר הוא חלק מהבדל מאלוקי, ויוסר נעשה תוך שינוי הצורה של הרצון לקבל, ששינוי הצורה זה עושה לחלק שעל ידו יצא מבחינת כל ונעשה לבחינת חלק. There's a long sentence. I'm just going to explain, and then I'll try and go back. I'll read it. I'll go back and read it in more detail. In the sense that the soul is a chelek, is a part of God's whole, because the godliness that's present within a soul is only proportionate to or only aligned with the Ratzon Lakabel of that soul. We saw this last time in the Baal HaSulam's Talmud Eser Sfiros, where he talks about he talked about this idea as well, that the new thing that's created is a Ratzon Lakabel. But the Ratzon Lakabel that exists is distinct, right? The reason why an apple is an apple, and an orange is an orange, is because the Kli, the Ratzon Lakabel that existed, to receive there's a unique Ratzon Lakabel that is fine-tuned to receive the godly energy, the Or Elokus, so to speak, that is the tiny, tiny sliver of God's will that equals apple. And that little bit of hashpa, that little bit of Or is received within the Kli, called Kli, is the Ratzon Lakabel to be an apple. And now you have an apple. And so, yeah, there's a chelek elokamimal there. Again, I'm using the example of an apple because this is much simpler than describing a human being. But think about it in terms of a human being. That apple is an apple and is a chelek elokamimal because the chelek is only the bit of the Ratzon Hashem, the bit of Or that corresponds to the Ratzon Lakabel that exists there. So if there's only a Ratzon Lakabel of this slice of God's will, then that's the aspect of God's will that's received into it. That Ratzon Lakabel is different from the Ratzon Lahashbos that exists within the totality of God. That affects its separation, and the separation manifests as this thing is only an apple, or it appears as only an apple because it's only expressing the aspect of God's Ratzon that is apple. And so too for orange, and so too for table, and so too for chair, and so too for me, and so too for you. I have a neshama. My neshama is a Ratzon Lakabel filled with Or, right? It's a will to receive an empty Kli that then receives whatever Or God is pouring down, and the Kli is ready to receive. That Kli, that Ratzon Lakabel, is separating whatever it receives from godliness, from the totality of godliness. And now that Kli with the Or that is in it is a neshama, is a soul. And so a soul is now a piece of the whole. It's separated from the whole by the fact that there's a difference between the soul, the part and the whole, the soul and God, in the sense that God doesn't need anything, and therefore God is total and all-encompassing and doesn't only express little bits and pieces. God expresses everything all at once. But the soul is a Ratzon Lakabel, and it can only express what it receives. And what it receives is a sliver of the Ratzon Hashem, because the Ratzon Lakabel is tuned in that way. And in that sense, we have now a chelek elokamimal, which, again, God is indivisible, so really the soul is holding everything, but the soul is only expressing or manifesting or revealing a part in tune or aligned with the Ratzon Lakabel that it has.
Basically, we're defined by our lack and our physical hungers, which depends on what and who we are. and then
Well,
the filling of it defines us.
correct. The filling of it defines us. That's the important
Right.
part, right? Meaning
Yeah.
our lack isn't us. I think that's a very important point. Meaning that, right? Meaning if we are a neshama, the neshama is a chelik elokami ma'al. Our lack is not chelik elokami ma'al. Our lack is actually very separate from God. Our lack is
Right.
the thing that separates us from God. What we are, a chelik elokami ma'al, is the stuff that's filling that void.
But different entities have different voids.
Correct, exactly so. Different entities have different voids, different, right?
And the echo is different than us.
Or
Right.
to put it, I'll put it slightly differently, right? Different voids produce different entities,
Okay.
right? Because if we want to think of it a little bit like sequentially, the voids are what are being created, right? That's creation. The fact that there's void A, void B, void C ad infinitum produces infinite created things because each void is filled and therefore reflects a particular slice. It's right, slice A, slice B of the or. Right. So what differentiates me from you is that there's a there's a Ratzon Lakabo called Shlomo. And the Ratzon Lakabo called Shlomo is receiving certain or that fills to one extent or another that Ratzon Lakabo. And to the extent that Ratzon Lakabo is present within that, to the extent to which that or is present within the Kli called Shlomo, it then expresses itself consistent with the Kli, which provides the definition, the form, the form, the structure that differentiates me from you.
And that's how it's supposed to work.
Right now, the consequence of this is, or one consequence of this is that to the extent that the Kli, the Ratzon Lakabo called Shlomo, is receiving or, Shlomo is connected to God, right? Because that or is godliness.
And you have the hana, and you have the enjoyment, you have the
You have the enjoyment. You're fulfilling the purpose of creation by actualizing or affecting the God's giving that hana to me, or me experiencing that hana. And the more alike I can be with God, meaning the more full I am and the less I lack, the more devekas I experience, right? I'm experiencing the more alignment I'm having with God, the more devekas I'm having, the more of a halachta b'drachav I'm manifesting, so to speak. The more I become a merkava for the Shechina b'tachtonim of God is revealed through my existence, more and more and more, because the more full I am, the less I'm a Ratzon Lakabel, and the more I'm just filled with awe. And the less, and therefore the spiritual distance, right? The Shinoi Tzura gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The distance between me and godliness becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and the Devekas becomes stronger and stronger.
So at some point we'll learn what keeps us from getting fooled.
Sorry?
Will we learn what keeps some people or some of us from getting as full as we could be?
Sure. On a basic level, though, I mean, he's going to talk about this.
That's what I think.
Right, there are many ways to understand this, but on a very, very basic level, part of this, at the deepest and most basic level, we are already full.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, do we see it or do we not see it? Do we experience ourselves as full or not? How much are we mavatel the Ratzon Lakabel and transforming the Ratzon Lakabel, which is grounded in a sense of independence and ego, or produces a sense of independence and ego and self-sustaining existence? How much are we mavatel? How much do we transcend that into a place of emunah and satisfaction and samach b'chelko and right sha'asali called sarki? Everything I have, everything is good. Gamzulatova, or whatever. There are many different ways of expressing the same idea, but it's all but really transformation of that perspective, which, because it's all already there. Remember, God is indivisible, so the small slice that I have actually contains the totality of everything. So I don't need any more than what I already have. I just need to be able to appreciate that what I have is already everything.
Interesting. Okay. Give.
Okay, last line. Hare she'ein beinehem ela shezeh kol v'zeh chelek. The only difference between the soul and God is that this God is everything, the whole, and the soul is a part. Ke'even hanachzeves menahar, like a stone that's been carved out of the mountain through the differentiation of essence, which is the fact that the stone is the soul, the stone exists with a ratzon lakabel, and the mountain does not. Something is different about these two things, essentially, in their essence. This bonin hativ. Understand this very well. Because I can't say any more about such lofty things. Okay, these are very big, very, very deep ideas. I'm done talking about them. This is as much as we're going to say about it. And that seems precisely so like a good place to stop. And after this, starting next week, we'll start building on the idea of where negativity, where darkness comes from. Where does this come from, right? Where, meaning this Ratzon Lakabo is something we touched on last week a little bit, but really he's dancing around until now, which is, okay, but this Ratzon Lakabo, which is really, you're telling me, the seat of separation or the situs or the cause of separation from godliness, and is really then the root cause of all head there, Elokos, the absence of godliness in reality, which means bad, not good, evil, materiality, negativity, harmfulness, absence of enjoyment, absence of the enjoyment God wants us to be having. Where is that really coming from if God is perfect, God is all encompassing, and God is all good? Where is it coming from? Okay, that's a much harder question to answer. That's going to take a much a longer meandering discourse to kind of get at. But we'll get there. We'll start to get there. Bezras Hashem next week. Thank you much. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Good night.
You know.
Yes, 100%.